This week I've had a break from digging out rock and I've been back working on some walls, although I have squeezed in a quick city visit as well. This is what I've been up to. We'll have and this little hole here. Previously I have cleaned up nearly all of the interior walls of the house, but until the building team finished their recent work in this part of the house, there have been some walls that I haven't been able to work on because there hadn't been a floor across there, and on the ground floor there had been a lot of props in the way. So this week I've been working on the walls in this space, starting with the downstairs room through here. First up, I had a bit of tidying up to do. And then I could get started with the work, which at this stage is all about cleaning the surfaces of the walls, ultimately so that I can repoint or finish the walls, but also to check the quality of the wall and the stones beneath the current surface material. For most of this work I was trying to avoid having to use power tools so that I could be a bit more careful with the stones, work without cables around and without the generator, and reduce the amount of dust. So for the first step in the process, I was chipping away the mortar with a hammer and occasionally with a chisel. On this part of this wall, a lot of the mortar was actually coming off fairly easily, so I made reasonable progress working my way across the wall. This was a tougher section with some cement that needed a bit more force. Once I'd knocked off as much mortar as I could, I then got on with cleaning out some of the joints between the stones. And then I worked on getting this block of wood out, which I'll talk about more a bit later on. After some lunch, I started work on the second wall, which is in slightly less good condition than the previous one. A lot of the material on this wall was tougher to take off, so pretty soon I needed to get some power tools in action. First of all, I was using this drill hammer, especially for the parts that had cement type material. I then moved on to using the grinder with a metal brush to clean out some of the thicker material and the joints in between the stones. and then I finished up for the day. The next day I was back working on the wall. But to start with, I had to fill up a deposit from the well with some water for cleaning the walls. Before using the water, I blew out as much dust and material as possible with the blower. And while I was waiting for the dust to settle, I did some prep work in the room upstairs. With the dust settled, I went back to spray down the walls downstairs to clean the stones and the joints. I was using a Karcher on a very low power setting, which I wouldn't normally do inside, but I figured in this open space and with the warm weather, it wouldn't cause too many problems. After the power wash, I was back upstairs to work on the other walls. The first wall had a thin layer of plaster on top of the mortar, and I wasn't sure how difficult it would be to take off. So to start with, I did some work by hand, which was fine for most of the mortar type material. The material on this wall actually was very similar to most of the other walls that I've cleaned in the house, so I was fairly confident that I could take it off easily. To amuse myself, I did start trying to get all the material straight into the buckets, a sort of chip and catch game. But I seemed to forget about this game for most of the wall later on. Because the wall looked in pretty good condition here, I was happy to use the power hammer for the thicker plaster lower down. With the warm weather now here, the vines in the field below the house are starting to grow very fast, and the weeds in the tracks in between need to be cleared. After lunch, it was time for some tidying up. And then I was back using the grinder to clear the thicker material and some of the joints. Unfortunately, when I went to change the brush, I managed to break the thread on the grinder, which has seen a lot of action. So I had to finish my work a little bit earlier than planned. The next day, with a new grinder to hand, I was back cleaning the joints. And then cleaning the dust and the material away from the wall. Before starting to clean the stones with some water using just a basic sprayer so as not to get the room and the floor too wet. And after a first spray wash, I then brushed off the surface with some very weak acid, which is able to take out the calcium-based mortar. After lunch, I wrote some notes on my desk to prepare for a meeting the next day, and while I was doing that, there were a couple of visitors to the room, who I hope won't want to return when the covers are back on the window. And then I was back working upstairs for a tidy up and starting work on the next wall. This room was actually once a kitchen, and these tiles were above a counter made of bricks. I'm actually not overly excited by the patterned tiles, but I thought it might be fun to try and use them somehow in the future if I could get them off okay. As you can see, I was able to save a few of the patterned tiles. I was less concerned about the white ones, although I did start playing chip and catch again with some pretty good results. Once the tiles were off, I started chipping away the mortar and some cement that had been underneath the tiles. I used the hammer and chisel for this work because I wasn't sure about the condition of the wall, as it has got quite a few noticeable cracks and the area around the old window looks very weak. The next day started with a couple of meetings before I was back working upstairs. I wanted to clear some of the mortar in that top left-hand corner, but wasn't sure how secure the beam was above it, so I put a prop in place just in case. Once I had taken off the easier material, I got the grinder back out to take off the thicker parts. And then I repeated the same steps as before on the other wall, with the blower, the water spray, and the acid brushing. And while I had my protective gear on, and as I had some of the solution left over, I used it for the downstairs walls. And after another tidy up, I decided I had just enough time for a quick afternoon trip to one of my favourite events of the year. Every year in the middle of May, in the city of Girona, there is a flower festival. In Catalan, it's called Temps de Flores, which means flower time. This year there are over 90 spaces or displays across the city, with most of them being in the streets and buildings of the old medieval centre. For my quick fly-through visit, I'm doing a quick loop of some of the displays, starting at the quieter end, underneath the old city wall. And I'm then making my way to the cathedral at the other end of the old centre. This year is the 70th anniversary of the festival, and thousands of people will walk the streets over the 10 days of the festival. Certain sites are used every year, and on this route I'm trying to see some of the better ones without hitting too many crowds. So I'm using quite a lot of smaller side streets and not stopping for all of the displays. I don't know too much about Girona, so I don't always know the stories behind some of the displays, but I do know that this one relates to the story of Saint Narcissus and some flies from his tomb that deterred some invading French forces in the 13th century. And I know this one relates to the dragon slayed by Catalonia's patron saint, Jordi. This is an area of the city where the crowds start to build up, so I'm taking a few more smaller side streets. And I'm now heading up a series of stepped streets to get up the hill that the old centre was built into. The front of the cathedral is normally the showpiece display of the festival, and there can be queues to get to it. But by arriving at the side of the cathedral, I'm hoping to be able to get there a bit quicker. The crowds were actually not too bad at this time, and I did really like this display. Now I'm heading back down towards the river via some narrower and even busier streets. Girona is very popular for cycling, and most years there is a display that celebrates this, just like this one here. I'm now in the old Jewish quarter of the city, and this area is particularly popular for visitors at all times of the year, but especially during the flower festival. And I'm now heading to one of the river bridges and a view of the city that features in a lot of photos and postcards. This bridge links to Plaza Independencia, which is one of my favourite sites in the city. There are normally music events in the evening during the flower festival, and I think one was happening here later on. Now I'm heading back to my starting point via streets on both sides of the river, including the Rambla, which is one of the busy entry points to the medieval city. I'm sorry I haven't been able to show you more displays and tell you more about the city, but I hope it's given you an idea of Girona's charm. And perhaps I'll come back here in a future video when I have more time and there are slightly less crowds around. I've now finished my work for the week and I'm going to do a bit of a review of the work that I've done. In my plans for this room, all of the walls will have a natural stone finish without any plaster or other material on top. And the first wall that I worked on is now just about ready for some repointing, but it will require a bit more cleaning before I can do that work, which will only be after some roof work has been done and when this corner has been reshaped with stones. But for now, I'm pretty pleased with the transformation of this wall this week. And then this second wall has also changed a lot this week. Although there is a lot more structural work to do to it in this space and around the window here and in this corner, all of which I'll need to do around the time that I'm doing work on the roof. And then this wall, which I haven't really touched this week, is going to need a lot of work, with stones to be added both here and on this side here, just like the wall below. Which, like the wall above, I haven't touched this week, but for two of the walls in here, there have been some pretty good changes this week. Although the first wall I worked on here won't actually have many stones showing in the future, as this space will be a kitchen and this whole wall will be covered by high units. So the work I've done this week has been more about reviewing the quality and condition of the wall and the stones within it. But this second wall will have a lot more stones showing, so it's been good to clear it up from how it looked before. Although it is going to need quite a lot of structural work around this corner, around the window here, and in this corner here. And earlier in the video, when I removed the block of wood from here, I said that I would talk about it a bit later on, because until recently, I wasn't absolutely clear what this area had been for with this hole and the gap up there. And I wasn't sure about the reason for this cube structure on the other side of the wall. But in talking to the builders about it, who've got a lot of experience of these types of features in these types of houses, I've now got a slightly better idea about what it might have been for. And to explain it, I need to show you what's on the other side of this gap. Because in the base of this space is a basin that is lined with ceramic tiles. And this little hole here is actually a connection between the ceramic basin on that side and the hole in here. And apparently this type of construction was used for wine production, with the space through there being filled with grapes and then crushed with the feet, and the juice coming through here and collected below. But to do that, someone would have had to clamber through that space there. And perhaps that's what that wooden block that was here, and where you've got these other spaces on this wall, perhaps that was wood to help get up to there or to hold other things in place when they were producing the wine. I am now thinking about how I can keep and use the ceramic basin on the other side, but for the rest of this area, I'm going to need to be filling it in and covering this space up. But the work to do that and the next work on these walls will be a bit later on, because next week I'm going to be back doing some excavation work and adding some rocks to this pile here, which I'm hopefully going to have some help with. And with more sunny weather forecast, I might do a trip somewhere. So I hope to see you then.